It was the summer of 1940. Nazi flags were already flying over Paris. Hitler's war machine had crushed country after country in a matter of weeks. The entire continent of Europe had fallen silent, conquered, broken. And now, only one nation remained standing between Adolf Hitler and total domination of the Western world. One island, one people, one man. And that man had just taken power. This is the story of Winston Churchill, the leader, who stared into the darkest abyss in modern history and refused to blink. Spring, 1940. Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg, a lightning-fast campaign of destruction that tore through Western Europe with terrifying speed. France, Belgium, the Netherlands. One by one, they crumbled. By June 25th, in a matter of mere weeks, the unthinkable had happened. Nazi Germany stood virtually unstoppable. And Great Britain stood entirely alone. Hitler's Luftwaffe, the most advanced and deadly air force the world had ever seen, was already positioning itself for aerial bombardments. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was being prepared. The walls were closing in. It was in this moment, this precise, terrifying, historic moment, that Winston Churchill stepped forward. On May 10, 1940, the very same day Germany invaded France and the Low Countries, Churchill replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. The timing was not a coincidence. It was destiny. Wearing a dark suit and carrying a cigar, Churchill had been warning about Hitler for years. While others whispered of diplomacy, Churchill had been screaming the truth. He had called out Chamberlain's policy of appeasement as dangerously naive, a strategy of feeding a wolf and hoping it wouldn't turn around and bite you. Nobody had listened. Until now, Churchill was considered unpredictable, controversial, too bold, too loud, too extreme. But in the darkest hour Britain had ever faced, unpredictable was exactly what was needed. In his first address to Parliament, he didn't sugarcoat. He didn't offer comfort. He offered the cold, brutal truth. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The room fell silent, because every man in that chamber knew he meant it. And somewhere across the English Channel, Hitler was watching. The situation was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers, British, French, Belgian, were pinned against the coastline of Dunkirk, surrounded by advancing German forces with nowhere left to run. The sea behind them, the Nazis in front. It looked like the end. Churchill refused to accept that. He ordered Operation Dynamo, a desperate, improvised, almost insane plan to evacuate soldiers directly from the beaches of Dunkirk. There were no guarantees. There was no playbook. Just fishing boats, civilian vessels, naval ships, anything that could cross the channel. And between May 26th and June 4th, over 330,000 Allied soldiers were pulled from the jaws of destruction. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance, but the danger wasn't over. Far from it. After France formally surrendered to Germany, pressure began building inside Churchill's own government. Powerful voices whispered, negotiate. Make a deal with Hitler. Find a way out. Save what's left. Churchill listened. Then he shut it down cold. He knew the truth, that others were too afraid to face any peace with Hitler was not peace at all. It was surrender disguised as diplomacy, and Churchill would rather burn Britain to the ground than hand it to a tyrant. He stood before Parliament, his voice like iron, and delivered words that would echo through history. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. He then began fortifying the entire nation. Coastlines were armed, civilian militias were organized, food was rationed. Churchill personally walked through bombed neighborhoods, side by side with ordinary people, not as a politician, but as a soldier in a different kind of war. The war for the soul of a nation. In the summer and fall of 1940, the Battle of Britain began. Hitler's Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of attacks against British cities and airfields. The sky over England became a battlefield. and the Royal Air Force outnumbered, exhausted, fighting around the clock somehow held the line. Churchill watched, he coordinated, he led. And when it was over, when the RAF had done what no one believed was possible, Churchill honored them with words that still send chills down the spine. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But Churchill knew that surviving wasn't enough. To win, Britain needed allies, real ones. In March 1941, Churchill pushed hard for the Lend-Lease Act, convincing the United States to supply Britain with weapons, ships, and food without requiring immediate payment. It was a lifeline. Britain would live to fight another day. Then, in June 1941, Hitler made a catastrophic mistake. He launched Operation Barbarossa, a full-scale surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. Churchill didn't hesitate for a single second. Despite spending his entire career opposing communism, despite distrusting Stalin deeply, Churchill immediately announced Britain's full support for the Soviets. When asked how he could possibly stand beside Stalin, Churchill was blunt. If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. The Grand Alliance was born. Britain, America, the Soviet Union, three powers that barely trusted each other, bound together by one shared necessity, the absolute destruction of Nazi Germany. Churchill became the glue that held it all together, coordinating, negotiating, maneuvering, playing a three-dimensional chess game on a global board where the stakes were the fate of civilization itself. By 1943, the tide had turned. Churchill's campaigns in North Africa had chipped away at Hitler's southern flank. The Allied invasion of Sicily and mainland Italy followed, cracking the Axis from below. Italy surrendered. The walls were closing in this time on Hitler. But the biggest move was still to come. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Churchill finally agreed to what would become the most ambitious military operation in human history, Operation Overlord, the full-scale invasion of Nazi-occupied France. D-Day. Churchill was terrified of failure. He knew the casualty numbers could be catastrophic, but he also knew it had to be done. Behind the scenes, he drove massive deception campaigns to mislead the Germans. He coordinated with Roosevelt and Stalin, he visited troops, he planned. And on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy became the turning point of the entire war. Allied forces swept across France. Paris was liberated. German lines began to collapse. Even during the desperate battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last savage counterattack in the winter of 1940, Churchill held firm, deploying British forces to support the overwhelmed Americans. By May 1945, it was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. And Churchill stood before a celebrating nation, the man who had refused to yield when every logical calculation said he should. But history is not always kind to its heroes. Just weeks after victory, the British people voted Churchill out of office. The man who had saved the nation was rejected at the ballot box. Churchill was stunned, but even in defeat, he remained graceful. Because Winston Churchill understood something most people never do, that some battles are won not for glory, but simply because they must be fought, and he had fought. Winston Churchill did not save Britain by being perfect. He saved it by being relentless. In the face of total collapse, when every rational voice said it was over, he chose defiance. He chose words that felt like weapons and speeches that felt like armor. He built alliances no one thought possible. He made decisions that history would later call brilliant, and endured losses that would have broken any other man. He was not just a prime minister. He was the last wall standing between democracy and darkness. And when the darkness finally retreated, when the Nazi flags came down and the smoke cleared over a battered but unbroken Britain, the world slowly began to understand what one man's refusal to surrender had meant. Everything. This has been the story of Winston Churchill. If history teaches us anything, it's this: the right person, in the right moment, Refusing to give up can change the entire world.